Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for attending. Very quickly, My name is Jonathan. I work with the company Niali, your host for this particular webinar series. Let's jump right in. What I wanted to say to the group is the entire theme of our webinar and this series that we're going to do is to be very intentional and to give a close look at aspects of lean, aspects of last planner system, and aspects of pull planning, but not from an academic dissertation level, much more so from a real world talk level. Not that there's anything wrong with the academic dissertations. Jim, I'm sorry, if I asked Jim to do that, he could absolutely do that. But what I did when we approached Jim is said, there's a lot of people out there that are probably looking at this from a boots on the ground perspective. Just tell me what the actual straight talk is here, both the good and the bad. And so our experience has been that there are a lot of people who are in that space, and that there's not a lot of places for them to go, maybe like a soft place to fall for them to get information and for them to get it in a no BS, no fluff sort of way. So that's our mantra. What we'll be doing in this webinar series today, but also continuing, is there will be no sales pitches. There's going to be no BS. There's going to be no fluff. We really want to understand this from sort of a boots on the ground perspective. Jim is perfect for this. We are all in a better place just for the fact that he is here. But before I introduce Jim, I'm curious. You can put this in the chat. The title of this webinar in particular is "Pull Planning is Bleeping Hard." So I know that there's someone on this particular call that has been trying to tell his entire team, I've been trying to tell you guys, this crap is really hard. No one's listening to me, so I'm going to attend this webinar that says it's hard. I'm going to bring back that information and put it in your face. I'm sure there's somebody on the call that's actually using that for that extent. Go for it. Feel free to. Let's enjoy our time. We're going to do this in about 30 minutes. At the end of the 30 minutes, we're going to do five topics. End of the 30 minutes, we're going to do a Q&A. Put your questions into the chat along the way, and then we'll bubble them up to Jim. Jim, without further ado, thanks for being here. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and hi, Kelly, for all the coordination that you did. My name is James Johnston. That's what you see on my LinkedIn account and things like that, but call me Jim. I'm a lean construction coach and trainer. I'm based in Winnipeg, Canada. This is all I do. I'm, I guess, technically called a management consultant, but I spend all of my time either teaching at local construction associations within private companies or coaching project teams to help use the last planner system and lean tools in a real practical environment. Spent a bunch of time over the last couple of years with a team rewriting the AGC's lean construction education program. I developed a number of courses that are approved as continuing education credits for a number of associations across North America. And I have a lot of fun working with some great people.
Thank you. And the first webinar that we had in this series in November was titled Pull Planning 101, essentially. And that was a look at to say, hey, this isn't all that complicated. It's not all that hard. But now we are on the other side of that coin, where we're actually going to say, this is a complicated process. It can be difficult. So with that said, we're going to jump straight into the first of our topics. And Jim, when you and I talked, you provided me a lot of insight, but without spelling it out. And each one of these particular topics that we're going to go through is its own conversation. We're going to do it in about 4 to 5 minutes. But the first one that you told me is last planner system, pull planning system. It's not complicated, but take us into that.
Yeah, it's not. You know, I think what I said to you, Jonathan, is that I could describe the last planner system to a teenager and they would understand what I mean. That doesn't mean that it's easy to do, but the concepts behind a last planner system, you know, planning in greater levels of detail, the closer you are to starting the work, making sure that you have what we call the inputs to a construction task before you start the task. So when you start, you can just kind of work to completion without interrupting the flow of work, right? That's kind of the point. And the last planner system is structured in ever more granular, detailed conversations that start with a milestone plan that every project has. And then we start to kind of break it down from there. The idea of it being a collaborative plan where you're working with the trades and the crews that are active on the project is really important because, well, the fact is that they have more information and more knowledge about the work that they do than anybody else. And so we need them to be an active participant in figuring out how to sequence work, how to work together with other crews and trades. We try to encourage those folks to treat each other in a different way than maybe they do in a traditional project
Hmm.
environment. So it's not that it's a complex idea. What makes it difficult to do is, well, probably two or threefold. I mean, firstly, we're asking people to sort of change their behavior, and folks have been doing things for a long, long time. Change is difficult, it's scary, a little bit
Hmm.
unsettling. And also it requires them to be maybe a little bit more open, honest, and vulnerable than we've been coached to be in a construction environment where, we're really risk averse and we try to keep, details pretty close to the heart, and we don't share a lot of information unless it's really necessary. And we try to change that behavior within the framework of the last planner system, where collaboration doesn't just mean that we're in the same room and looking
Right.
at the same information, but we're actually sharing information and we're sharing needs, wants, and sequencing in a meaningful way. But most importantly, the focus of optimization changes. In a traditional environment, every crew or every trade on a project is focused on optimizing their scope of work. And that's rational behavior. That makes sense. But what we know is that if you optimize each piece of a project, that doesn't necessarily lead to an optimal project,
Mm.
because the reality is that if you optimize one crew or trade's work, that might not be the best thing for the project or for the follow-on trade. What I get caught saying an awful lot is that projects live and die at the handoff, when work is being handed off from one crew or one trade to the next. And when those handoffs are clean, well understood, communicated, and healthy, projects tend to go well. All
You
too
had
often, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, sorry, go ahead.
No, all too often, those handoffs are, well, clunky. You know,
Hmm. You had
picture a re-
mentioned sorry.
sorry.
No, I keep
Go ahead.
interrupting. Go ahead. Go
Go,
ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jonathan. Go
Oh
ahead.
no, I'm just
All good.
I'm thinking of the traditional style of project management, which is more of a command and control structure than that collaborative structure. But once a client of yours, or you see a general contractor start to adopt the LPS principles, you mentioned to me early on, you're like, then we also see that there are moments where they can quote unquote fall off the wagon. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, when you're trying to change the way that people have done things for a long, long time, it's new, it's different.
Mm.
You've got the required meaningful input from a variety of different organizations and stakeholders. And listen, when you try something new, sometimes it doesn't go all that
Mm.
well, at least not initially. And we tend to go back to the things that we know when life gets hard. And sometimes that happens when you're trying to implement lean in the last planner system, because it doesn't go the way that you kind of pictured it. And so there's a little bit of panic and uncertainty and uneasiness that sets in, and we revert back to centralizing decision making. So when you say the words command and control, and
Hmm.
that's a term that's used a lot to describe a traditional sort of superintendent or project leader, I call that centralized decision making.
Hmm.
And when you describe the role of a traditional superintendent, man, it sounds exhausting. They have to gather information from all of the different stakeholders and trades. They have to status the project, and they have to distill all of that information into an executable plan every single week, and then
Yep.
distribute that information, communicate that information to all of the different work executors, and somehow hold them to account to make sure that that work is actually happening in the sequence. And it's an everyday, all day type activity. It's a crazy ask. And by and large, it's difficult to succeed. And what we find in traditionally run projects is the larger the project, the more likely it is to finish either behind schedule or over budget. And we find that a lot of projects, well, we call it crash land.
Mm.
They end up flooding the job with labor and kind of hitting a bit of the panic button in the final few weeks or couple of months of the project. And it doesn't help. It actually makes life a little bit worse.
Mm.
That's pretty
Yeah.
normal.
Yeah. All right. Next topic. This is one that that is very fascinating to me, because you've said to me, you look to redefine and ask for your customers to sort of take a different look at what a customer is. Isn't a typical example of a customer pretty straightforward? Someone who pays you to provide them a product or service.
Yeah, when I talk to a group of general contractors and ask that question, who's your customer? They all give me the same answer. It's the owner, it's the client, whoever wants them to build what they're
Right.
building. Because there's a one-to-one relationship there, right? There's some sort of contractual relationship where the general contractor is providing products and services in return for payment. And there's a real clear understanding where if one party doesn't do what they say they're going to do, there's some remedies. You talk to subcontractors, and typically they'll point to the general contractor and say, that's
Hmm.
my customer because
Hmm.
they're paying me to do what I do. And what I try to do is to get the crews and subcontractors on a project to start to look at each other in a bit of a different way. Start to look at them as having sort of a customer and supplier relationship, not in the traditional sense where money is
Hmm.
changing hands,
Hmm.
but anytime you're handing the project over from one step to the next step, that's a type of customer and supplier relationship. Now, we're conditioned in business to satisfy our customers. So the question that I ask is, how are you going to satisfy that next step in the process, that customer, if you don't really understand
I
what
see.
matters to them and what doesn't matter to them, what they need and what they don't need? You need to make that connection. I mean, this is a
So
very human to human business.
So then, if I'm hearing that right, a general contractor at certain moments of this process in this system, the subcontractor will be their customer and vice versa, potentially, if I'm hearing this right. Subcontractors, they could actually be each other's customers at certain points during however the handoff exchange is going. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really about the relationship between the subcontractors. Projects are just a network of promises, series of commitments.
Mm.
So the role of the superintendent is to orchestrate those relationships, to be a coach or a leader, to try to optimize the project as a whole and give people the best chance to succeed. So when the subcontractors recognize that their job really is to just prepare the project so that the next trade or crew can start their work, it changes the way that they think of the work that they're doing. And they start to maybe focus on different things. They start to look at quality in a different way. They start to look at the housekeeping requirements, the completeness of their work in maybe a different way. And last planner system conversations are designed to make sure that those connections are clear, are well understood. The fundamental goal being that we have smooth and predictable and reliable workflow, control of the production system. Once you have control, you have a chance to improve it. But without control, it's some level of chaos, and making meaningful improvements is darn near impossible.
What is there an instance where the general contractor might be the customer to the subcontractor in this paradigm you're talking about?
Yeah, I understand kind of where your head might go with that. And I don't traditionally look at it that way. I'm really focused on the flow of work.
Hmm.
And the most important relationships to foster are those relationships between the work executors. I mean,
Mm.
the definition of a last planner is planning done by the people closest to the work. And the definition or the characteristics that a last planner needs to have is really twofold. Subject matter expertise. They need to
Hmm.
know everything there is to know about the work that they're doing so that they can estimate, time
Hmm.
and resources, and they understand how the work is going to get done. But that's only part of the puzzle. The other piece is that they need to have the authority to make a decision, to make a commitment. And you need both of those characteristics in the same person when you're having those last planner system meetings and conversations.
A lot of what you're talking about, and which brings us straight to the second point, is sort of a paradigm shift, right? Conceptually, which can happen quickly, potentially, right? It could, or as you and I talked, we talked about this. It's out there. It is said that to change a habit, it takes 21 days, and then there's other
Mhm.
studies that say it takes a certain amount of behaviors to change a habit. What do you look at when you say to do this? We would be looking at changing habits. What habits are you talking about?
Well, I think the habits that we're talking about are the perspective of what success in the project means. Now,
Uh,
every crew and every trade on the project, I mean, first and foremost, they're trying to make a living. They're trying to
mhm,
make some profit on the work that they're doing, and that's okay. That's required. I encourage that. But sometimes they get really focused on their own success and failure. And when pressure increases, they get more and more focused on their success and failure. And sometimes that's to the detriment of the project. So the term that I use and a lot of people in the lean community use is local optimization. What that means is that you're optimizing the time and resources and success or failure of that one scope of work, that one crew's work. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're handing the project off to the next step in the best way for the next step.
Mm,
Lean at its core is about being very customer focused, on understanding what value is from the customer's perspective. And we generally look at that, pretty broadly in terms of the customer of the project as a whole. But if you break it down, the same attributes can be, described in the relationship between the trades. If we get the trades to think of each other as customers and suppliers, and they take that same point of view, that we're focused on success of the customer, on providing value to the customer, it changes the way that we think of the work that we do and the planning that we do on a project. And I mean, many people have seen the data or the stat of you can change a habit in 21 days. There's some conflicting opinions on that. In practice, and what I see is that it takes longer, particularly when
yeah.
we're talking about changing the way that we organize and manage and execute on a construction project. And so when I'm working with a new company or a new team, and we talk about balancing the production system and how we batch or phase the production system, when we talk about the planning system and all of the stuff, what I ask from them is that they actually can make a commitment of about 90 days. That they say, we're going to plug in and do this the way that we're supposed to do this for 3 months.
Hmm.
And if after 3 months you can honestly look at me in the face and say, this doesn't work, this doesn't make a difference, this is not a better mousetrap, we'll have that conversation. Then I'm happy to.
Hmm.
But until you actually give it the opportunity to grow and succeed and
Hmm.
become normal, you're not going to know. And that's one of the issues that we find, is that teams sometimes just don't give it a chance.
Do you find that that 90-day window is that inclusive of the time frame it takes for the project manager or the super to say, I'm going to take this on, I'm going to start using LPS, I'm going to start doing pull planning, and it's going to take that person, we'll just say 21 days to really get comfortable with that change of habit. But then they also need to quote unquote sell their customer, the subcontractor, on the idea and get them into that same sort of flow. Is that all part of that 90 days, going past that 21 days of ish, that to change the habit for the PM?
I treat the team as a team, and the project leader or the superintendent and project manager coordinator, that leadership team, well, they're just part of the greater team. And so they're all trying to change habits, and oftentimes they're kind of learning together. The role of the superintendent is changing, the role of the
Hmm.
trades is even changing. And so I don't kind of separate those two.
Hmm.
And what I find is that creates a cohesiveness.
Gotcha. So in that sense, going back to that 90-day window, the PM has adopted it and is then putting it into play for however long. Say it takes them only 21 days or 2 weeks to change their habits, but now they're actually putting it into practice and kicking the tires and moving the needle, so to speak, for 90 days. And that's when you say, at that point, if you tell me that it's not working or it's not going well, I'll know that you've given it that fair amount of time to really give it the test run that it should have. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. But here's the interesting part of that, is that when teams have actually done that, when they buckled down and said, we're going to commit to a cadence of planning, and we're going to use these concepts the way that they're supposed to be used, and we're going to
Hmm.
reach out and ask for help
Mm,
along the way. And that's an important part of
that's a
this.
big
Don't get
one.
me wrong. Um, I've never had a team come back and say, no, I think we're going to abandon this and just kind of go back to that command and control thing that we've been doing all along. This is not better. I've never had a team do that when they worked and did the hard work to change habits and to change behaviors and to use new systems of execution.
Okay, so in the vein of what the subject matter is for this particular webinar, have you ever had a team that has done those pieces, but it still didn't work for them and they decided not to do it?
I haven't. I haven't. When teams commit to lean in the last planner system, when they commit to looking at the construction site as a production system,
Hmm.
when they use production laws, when they organize properly, when they begin to see waste where it exists, when they attack variation, like this is not just a one tool idea.
Hmm.
This is a change of behavior. This is a multi-pronged approach to changing project success. When that happens, it works. Now it works to varying degrees, and it is a growth curve. So we're never flicking a switch and the sun comes out and the rainbow appears. It's it is about, I call it turning the dial. I
It's a
call it
change.
making, yeah, let's make this project a little bit better than the last project was. And we're gonna learn from this one and make the next one a little bit better again. Not only that, but even within the project, week by week by week, we see those cycles of continuous improvement happening. And that's baked into the idea of lean.
The way you're describing it, it occurs to me that it's at best a change of ecology for the entire project team. Balance or batch, balance, and pull. This is new to me. So what does that mean?
Well, these are production laws that historically have been a little easier to understand in a more manufacturing type environment where the product moves and batch size means number of pieces. People can kind of get their head around that a little easier. In the framework of construction, batch balance and pull means that we're trying to work in the smallest practical batch or phase or zone. So when we look at a project, we try to dice it up into these chunks of work where trades flow through each chunk sequentially. And we want that chunk of work to be smaller instead of larger. Now, sometimes crews or trades, well, they'd like larger areas. They want to work in bigger batches. And
Hmm.
the mentality that I hear sometimes is that, well, yeah, that gives us a chance to build momentum and we can staff up and nobody's in our way. And we'll get a whole bunch of work done in a short period of time, and that's going to be good for your project. And the truth of the matter is that the bigger the batch, the slower the project. And as batch size comes down, now there's a practicality in terms of how small it gets, and how, we don't want people working right on top of one another, and there are equipment requirements. So there's a practicality about how small is small. But what we see is as the zoning gets smaller, project duration drops. And theoretically that never stops happening, but there is a practicality element, and I try to use some practical limitations to make lean make sense in a construction environment.
Give
So
me an example of, sorry to cut you off. Give me an example of in a 4-story office building construction
sure,
project. What would a reasonable batch be in
you're
that
not
environment?
you're never going to get a number.
Okay.
I've heard people say, oh, 10,000 square feet is a good number. You don't know that. It's about work intensity. So when I talk to a team about this, and let's use that 4-story example for this conversation. What I would ask them, if you were going to do some interior framing on that office building, would you
Hmm.
release all 4 floors to a framer all at
Right.
once
Right.
and prevent anything else from happening in those 4 floors until the framing was done? And the answer is, of course not. And so I start to question them. So what do you release to trades? Well, maybe a floor at a time. And so I'll ask the question, why not half a floor? Why
Hmm.
not a quarter? If it's a commercial building, then why not one commercial unit at a time, imagining that there are 10 commercial units
Hmm.
per floor?
Hmm.
There's a practicality of how small, but I continue to
Yeah.
put pressure on the size of the batch because it decreases the stagger between the trades and the handoffs become quicker. When you look at how the actual schedule works out, you end up saving a pretty significant amount of time. You also have uh, some sort of hidden efficiencies, like the identification of quality issues happens faster because what we
Hmm.
find is that oftentimes quality issues are detected by follow-on trades. And when you're working in larger batches, there's more work that's completed and may be done incorrectly before you catch it. Now,
In
the
in the
idea of, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
No,
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 go
go
ahead.
ahead.
In the example of a 4-story office building, and let's just say that your GC decides that half of a floor is their batch size, then what is the balance aspect to this?
So the idea of balance in construction is that we'd like the actual duration that each crew or trade takes to finish their work in each batch to be as close to the same as possible. In manufacturing, they have the luxury of being able to engineer workstations down to sometimes within seconds in duration of completion of the work.
Hmm.
and you know, the line moves at a certain cadence. Well, that idea, when adapted to construction, asks us to try to reduce the variation between the duration of time if you're looking at a framer and an electrical contractor and a mechanical contractor and, you know, a
Hmm.
drywaller and a painter. Let's try to get some balance in terms of how long it takes them to move through each zone. And if we do that, we have less work sitting there waiting for workers. So when I talk about this, there's two sides of the efficiency coin. There's resource efficiency, which is optimizing the resource of each crew or trade, or there's flow efficiency,
Hmm.
which is improving the efficiency of
Hmm.
flow through the project. And what we want is that we want as little time where work is not happening in an area as possible.
Hmm.
And I see in the chat that the word tact has appeared. And that's kind of the idea. When we hear tact, sometimes we don't understand that, you know, in many ways, tact is about working in smaller batches and balancing the production system. That's what a tact plan
Hmm.
is. It doesn't have to be this scary, super specific thing. Batch, balance, and then pull is about absorbing variation and controlling the release of work based on what the next step needs on downstream demand.
Hmm.
Because you're never going to have perfect production in construction
Hmm.
because there are sources of variation that we can't control. And so there are some bumps in the road. What we don't want to do is we don't want to overburden downstream trades. We don't want to release more work to them than they can handle because that starts to create some behaviors that actually are detrimental to project success. They start to rush, they feel pressure, and then you start to get into the cultural pieces, the behavioral pieces like resentment or morale
Yeah.
drops.
Right. Is percent plan complete, PPC, is that a good metric to measure the batch balance and pull that you're talking about?
So PPC isn't about measuring, you know, batch size or balancing. PPC is a measure of what percentage of the tasks on a weekly plan are actually getting done.
Hmm.
And the reason that PPC became a metric when the last planner system was first introduced, because they recognized that the success of a plan meant that you've collaborated, you've thought about what the needs are, you've made sure the tasks were free of constraints before they started. And if you came up with a really good plan, you had a better chance of getting more of those tasks fully completed during that week. Because the goal of every task is to hand the project off to the next step. And
Hmm.
if you're not done that task, you're not handing the task off. And so PPC, percent plan complete, is simply a measurement of what percentage of the tasks that you planned for the week actually got finished. And what
Mm.
we find is that as PPC goes up, that's an indication of higher quality plans. And as we plan better, we end up having more project success.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for that. And then the last thing I wanted you to elaborate on too, pull planning is bleeping hard. There's a lot of complexities potentially to it. There are some difficulties to implementing and continuing to implement it and carry it through on the project. But not so that I don't want to ever leave people with the glass half empty, so to speak. A lot of teams are pulling this off. There's a lot of teams that are increasingly more teams out there that are seeing the benefits to it. So can you speak to that when it comes to, yeah, there are some difficulties, and let no one else tell you that it's simple and it's easy to do. There are some difficulties, but people are doing it. You got, teams out there. You guys can do this.
Every construction team has the ability to do this because you have the knowledge. Now, the term pull planning is sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes people say lean construction is pull planning, or the last planner system is pull planning. And sometimes people will say, hey, when you're planning the execution of a project, you always have to start with the target and work your way backwards and do it one step at a time. And that's technically what the last planner system would suggest happens during a phase pull plan, is that you are creating a sequence working backwards from a target. Listen, in practice, my approach is to get tasks up on a visual board so that we understand the work that has to happen and so that the trades can talk about how the work is going to flow between the experts. And they have all of that information. And once you get something up on a wall, listen, people only talk about the things that they can see. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we have tasks described in a way that allows them to see the flow of work, well, they can visualize how the work is going to happen. And
Mm-hmm.
they can have the right conversation with the right person. They can clarify things. And I've been in multiple planning meetings where trades have come to the general contractor or a consultant and explain why there was an issue and also what the fix was after
Mm.
they've determined it. They have the information. Every construction team does. What I find is that when you give them an opportunity and when you give the trades and the crews an environment to have meaningful input, and that they believe that their input is accepted, wanted, and needed, well,
Mm.
they do and they can. This is not beyond any crew or trade. In some cases, they're kind of doing some of this in a real informal way out in the field,
Right.
in spite of what the general contractor might be doing. So this is about taking this and creating a system to allow all of that knowledge, all of that talent, all of that expertise to influence the project in a meaningful way. Frankly, there's one of the wastes that we identify in construction called non-utilized talent. It's the most insidious type of waste because you're not using the information, the knowledge, the creativity,
Huh.
the experience that exists. This allows us to make sure that we don't fall victim to that type of waste when it comes to planning how our project is going to run.
So before we get to the Q&A, Jim, one thing, if for the people that are on this call, those that are embarking or looking to embark or looking to start, what are give top 2 or 3 things that they should do if they haven't actually jumped fully into the pond, so to speak, of LPS or lean or pull planning? One would be look for a consultant like yourself, potentially, right? What are the 2 or 3 things that you would say if you haven't yet started, but you're about to consider these 2 or 3 things?
Yeah, step one is to make sure that you do provide some level of education or context to the people that are going to be doing this because they need to understand the why.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and
Mm.
sometimes there's organizations that have folks inside the company that can provide that, and sometimes you have to go outside the company, get somebody like me that's able to kind of deliver that message. So step one is provide some education, and it depends on where you are in a project to truly answer that question. But what I find is that if you start first of all with making sure that the superintendent or leader of the project is having good, healthy daily huddles with
Mm-hmm.
the team, that's the first step in coordinating work and making sure that at the very least, we understand the day that's in front of us. The heart and soul, I believe, of the last planner system is exposing and clearing constraints or roadblocks so that work can just happen. And so I think that identifying those and making sure that we've got those identified a few weeks in advance so that our project managers and coordinators and consultants and procurement people can help address those constraints is really mission critical
Mm.
to helping construction projects succeed. So if you can just do what's called a make ready plan, which is, hey, get the band together and let's look out a few weeks, identify work that's not going to happen for a month or more. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. All of the work executors are able to project out a few weeks and say, yeah, this is kind of what I'm going to have to be doing. If we can figure out, what are the resources that you're going to need? Do you have the material on site or do you need to
Mm.
order it? Is there specialty equipment? Is there an answer that you're waiting for? Do you have to get a permit? Is there a change order that has to get signed? Is there information that you need or are there resources that you need that you don't already have? If we expose those issues far enough in advance, we give our project leadership team a fighting chance to clear
Mm-hmm.
those out of the way so that when the work is ready to start, it can just start. So get some education, start with the daily huddle, and work on clearing constraints. If you start there, you're going to see an
I love it.
immediate bump in project success.
I love that. And that actually works well with the first question from Mr. Jeff Haynes, where he says in the chat, I'm finding that the clunkiness is really evident from the pre-construction to the operations. What are your thoughts, Jim, on making that simpler? And I just want to add something before I jump in there too. One of our experience points too is that a lot of people I have found look at LPS pull planning as a construction phase only solution. And I'm really glad that Jeff, that you put in this as into the actual pre-construction, where it makes sense from the very inception, the pre-construction phase, all the way through to the building going live. So, what is your thoughts, Jim, on that clunkiness that he's talking about? and how to make
Yeah,
it simpler.
we see this all the time where you've got some sort of a planning function in a company where they're coming up with a sort of a baseline schedule and an estimate, and they're trying to figure out the approach to construction, and they're doing some work, oftentimes, unfortunately, in isolation from builders, and then they're kind of tossing that over the wall into the hands of the execution team. And so one of the things that really helps is to make sure that there's a clear handoff that happens. And so that the execution team has an opportunity to really digest and learn from the planning team about what their assumptions were. What did they expect was going to happen? What do they think the pattern of labor is going to be?
Mm.
You know, to be honest, I was having a conversation about this very issue at the Lean Construction Institute's Congress in Detroit in October, and we were talking about what happens when master plans have to change during
Mm.
construction. And the issue that teams have is that they don't understand the assumptions that were made, the work that went into the initial plan, and so they end up having to almost rework the entire thing because they don't have the information.
Mm.
And the metaphor is this: a lot of times kids in school, right? They're smart kids. They're doing a math test. They look at a question, they can immediately see the answer. They can visualize it. So they put the answer down, and then they're upset that they only got part marks. Why? Because
Ah,
they didn't show their work.
yes.
So what we want the planning team to do is show your work so that you can communicate that. And that takes some of that clunkiness that Jeff is describing away.
And increases the collaboration. Yeah, I love it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Next question from another James. Do you think that LPS in other sectors is easier to implement than in construction due to the high volume and variation of both product and environment?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a matter of easier or more difficult. I think the actual operation or yeah, maybe the success or ease of implementation of the last planner system might vary depending on the industry. So I've worked with a couple of architecture firms
Mm.
to use the last planner system to help control their workflow. And one of the things that we learned in doing that is that the level of variation and sometimes required what we call negative iteration or rework is kind of baked into the process of doing design. And so we had
Huh.
to adjust our expectations in terms of how much variation is just a natural and normal part of the evolution of work in that type of an environment. And you might find the same thing if you're using the last planner system to control work in software development or in policy development in government. Any project environment can use the basics of the last planner system because at the end of the day, it's about making sure that work is flowing smoothly. And again, it's
Hmm.
about the handoffs. We see handoffs in almost every type of work there is. It's
Hmm.
not just construction.
Scott Gill puts in a great question, which is each batch we talked about, is it a swim lane? Could it be a lane?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. And I've seen planning boards that are structured like that. I've also seen planning boards that are structured where each lane is a trades lane, and that helps them organize and see how work is flowing between the work executors. Um, the lean police are not going to descend on your project team trailer and arrest you if you do it one way or the other. For me, as long as information is being developed visually and collaboratively, that's going to help. How you organize depends on the size and complexity of your project. But yes, each batch could be a lane. Sometimes there's no lane at all. It's about getting the information and seeing the work flowing.
Um, DJ put in there, you spotted this earlier on. Sounds like a tact plan. What would you say, compare and contrast a pull plan versus a tact plan? They're very similar, and there's a few differences.
Well, I mean, tact is a way of organizing work. It's about
Mhm.
creating batches so that the time that each trade takes to finish their work in each subsequent batch is the same, or they're given the same amount of time. Sometimes that means that some trades have a little bit of downtime. And in a tact plan, and really in a batch balanced pull plan, you don't work ahead because all that's going to do is either create a situation where there's work that's kind of in the way of the next trade, or it might overburden the next trade. So when you hear a tact plan, what that really is at its basics, is a batched, balanced, and pulled plan.
Mm,
Releasing work that your customer needs to, having balance between the trade durations, and working in the smallest practical batch.
I love that. I like breaking it down to bite-sized chunks like that. Focus on this, not on this, so to speak, right off the bat. VJ says or asks, how do we define a batch when we are at the design development phase of the project? He's finding it difficult to implement LPS in the design phase.
Okay, so if you're talking about controlling workflow through the design phase, yeah, it's a little bit different. But if you think about the progression of work from initial project definition or concept through to completed design documents, there are natural progressions of work through the design phase. And sometimes what happens as designers, we tend to work in larger batches because we want to develop and approve design details in bigger chunks. And what we see with the last planner system specifically is that the milestones or the touchstones in the plan are when decisions need to be made, not necessarily when work is executed. So that's a little bit of a different approach that might work and might help you, VJ.
There's a longer group of questions here, which I'm going to get to in the last 3 minutes. So there's several here. I think this is from Jeff as well. So thank you for these, Jeff. I agree with the team approach. The challenge is clients, whom I define as those who we are building for, and that is the contractual relationship, no matter how much we want it to be otherwise. And then he asks, interested on your thoughts on how this applies to lean planning. Should we try to have the client involved? We work with the same contractor 60% of the time.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Some of the most successful projects has had a client representative in planning meetings on a weekly basis, because what I find is that oftentimes clients have information or need to provide information to the execution team that help the success of their own project. In an ideal world, it would start with the client. In an ideal world, the client would say, listen, I want to do this project, and I support the use of lean in the last planner system, and I really want us to be using those tools and techniques throughout, and I'm going to be supportive of that, and I'm going to do everything that I can to be an active participant. That would be great. And
right.
And listen, in the lean community, we're working real hard to try to educate owners on the value of lean and why it matters and why they should sort of adopt and embrace that idea. But even if the owner doesn't sort of buy in or even understand what lean in the last planner system is, that doesn't necessarily mean that the general contractor and the trade contractors can't execute using those tools and techniques on their own. We sometimes even see trade contractors where the general contractor is trying to run this project very traditionally, and they're saying, listen, we've got kind of a scope of work here that we feel like we as a little trade group have some control of, and we're going to kind of coordinate our activity because we know that that's the best way for all of us to succeed. So you need to not look at it as an all or nothing sort of equation. We find that batch sizes change as the project proceeds. The batch size that you might use during a foundation scope of work may be different than the batch size that you would look at during a structural steel and cladding and close-in phase of work, which might again be different than a finishing phase of work. And that's okay. As a matter of fact, it's required. Right? It's about getting to milestones. It's about getting to those places where you can look at the next phase of work, where you can look at the next chunk of work and figure out what's going to work for the project team. That's why you need the trade experts and the crew leaders involved in making these decisions. They need to have influence. They have information.
Thank you for that. And right up against time here, I'm going to finish though. Give this last second part to his question some airtime. So any folks who need to jump, please do, of course. But he also asks, do you feel that there is a difference in the plan approach, pull planning, versus the schedule adherence contractual? It seems like when we enforce contractual obligations, the pull planning becomes much harder to do.
Yeah, oftentimes what we see with contractual obligations is that they're tied to a master schedule that was oftentimes developed right at the front end of a project, in some cases even before the project was awarded. And when you think about those master schedules, those are developed at the very point in time where the project team knows the least amount about the project. And oftentimes they're developed in isolation from the people that are going to work on the project.
100%.
and we tend to look in bigger chunks of work, and we link starts and finishes together. That's not the way that work actually flows on a project site. And you're quite right. When clients are really married to this idea of a critical path schedule or a master schedule, and we have to be doing certain things as the master schedule says that we're supposed to be doing them, that's really destructive to teams. And that's
Hmm.
one of the reasons that we crash land projects and we end up hurting people at the end of projects when we force feed work into the project based on those initial master plans. The whole
Right.
idea of the last planner system is we plan in greater detail when we're closer to the work, because that's when we have the best opportunity and the best information to figure out how work is going to flow smoothly. Smooth equals fast, and that's how you succeed in construction.
Yeah. Marty just sent in another question. Do you find it helpful to hold mini seminars or education for trade partners? If so, should we include senior management or last planners or both?
Absolutely. As projects progress, I advocate for having a series of small educational opportunities so that as new trades come into the project, they start to hear the same thing that trades that were involved at the start of the project hear. And every time, I mean, I do a lot of education. I talk a lot to groups of people. And oftentimes, people that are in those sessions, well, they've heard me say the same thing before, but they hear it differently the second time,
Hmm.
and then they hear it differently the third time. It takes time to kind of distill that information. People hear things differently as they start to make connections mentally themselves, and they start to see things. Knowledge is not competency, and they take time to they take time to transition.
I want to thank you, Jim, for giving us your time, folks. We're gonna go ahead and close this down. We will be doing each month throughout the rest of the year. We'll be doing another webinar. I'll send everyone on this list here what that will be, but it's going to be similarly themed to looking at things from a less academic level, like I said early on. Jim, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for this, and stay on with me as people drop off, if you would.
Yeah, my
Thank
pleasure. Hey, thanks everybody for taking the time. I appreciate it. Any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to, Jonathan and the team at Niali or myself.
Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.